evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jackie Stevens. It's my pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies this evening. This evening marks the 14th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Dinner, and I'm pleased to be part of this auspicious occasion. The reason we gather each year is twofold: to pay tribute to someone who has a brilliant record of civil rights advocacy. This year, that person is UCLA alumnus and noted civil rights attorney, Johnny L. Cochran, Jr. Yes. And also, we join together to celebrate the work of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies here at UCLA. Now in its 34th year, the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies is entering into a new phase of continued excellence and increased scholarly activity. The center fulfills its mission by promoting research and academic programs, maintaining a library, putting on special projects, and publishing current work in African American studies. It is one of the leading centers of its kind in America. And leading the center in his second year as director is Professor Darnell Hunt. Professor Hunt received a BA in journalism from USC, an MBA from Georgetown, and a PhD in sociology from UCLA. As a sociologist, Professor Hunt's research is concentrated on images of blacks in the media, particularly in television. The author of 2 books and numerous other publications. He is currently working on a center-sponsored 5-year study of how blacks are used in prime time television, as well as the politics associated with those portrayals. Now, he's also editing a 4-book series on African Americans and the media to be jointly produced by the Center and Oxford University Press. Professor Hunt's goal is for the Bunche Center to reinforce its status as one of the most influential sources of scholarship on African American experiences and communities. So let me bring forward Dr. Darnell Hunt.
Thank you, Jackie. Welcome. Students, parents, board members, dinner committee, faculty, staff, and friends of the center. On behalf of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 14th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Dinner. I'd like to start by just taking a few moments to recognize some special individuals in attendance this evening. First, I'd like to recognize the many current UCLA students who are present. They are scattered throughout the ballroom. Please take the time to chat with them this evening. I'm sure they'll share with you all the exciting things that young people at UCLA are involved in. Next, I'd like to acknowledge some special guests. First of all, we have Los Angeles Unified School District Board member Janethia Hudley Hayes. We have Los Angeles Unified School District Board member Caprice Young. City of Los Angeles Deputy Mayor Brian Williams. Office of the Governor, Field Representative Flo Ward. Office of the Speaker of the Assembly, Herb J. Wesson, Jr., Special Assistant to the Speaker, Akili. Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney Greg Jennings. Los Angeles City Attorney's Office Director of Communication Derek Tunnell. Office of United States Senator Dianne Feinstein, Field Representative Haleh Kavari. It's a long list, so bear with me. Office of Councilwoman Janice Hahn, Field Representative Myron Cotton. Office of Supervisor Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, Director of Communications Glenda Weena. Judge Joe Brown. Judge David Sotelo. Judge Cheryl Luke, Judge Albert Matthews, Vice Chancellor, UCLA Graduate Division, Dean of Graduate Studies, Claudia Kernan, Vice President, Educational Outreach, UC Office of the President, Winston Doby, Dean, Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences, Amy Dorr, one of my colleagues in the Ethnic Studies Centers, Chan Noriega, Director, Chicano Studies Research Center. Executive Director, California African American Museum, David L. Crippens. Now, this evening's event, of course, would not have been possible without the generous support of our many sponsors, and they are as follows. Bear with me, another long list. Winston Doby, UC, Office of the President, Educational Outreach. Marion Broom, Robinson's May, UCLA Office of Community Partnerships. State Senator Richard Alicorn, African Diaspora Foundation. Walter Allen, Renee Campbell, the CARE Foundation, the Cochran family, the Cochran Firm, the Four Seasons Hotel, Alfreda Eigelhart, Daniel Johnson, Ricky Ivey, Daryl Johnson, Claudia Kernan, UCLA Graduate Division, George Lopez, Nestle, Al Osborne, Pat Penny Realtors, Rita Rothman, Second Baptist Church, Bobby Smith, Peter Taylor, Oscar Turner, UCLA Black Alumni Association, UCLA Black Faculty and Staff Association, UCLA Government and Community Relations, UCLA Office of Student Affairs, UCLA School of Law, and Dr. C.Z. Wilson. Finally, we are blessed this evening to have one of LA's most dynamic personalities as our Master of Ceremonies, Director of News and Public Affairs for KGLH FM Radio, Jackie Stevens. Jackie? Thank you all. It is fitting in the year that we renamed the center after UCLA's most distinguished alumnus that we welcome back another outstanding alumnus, Johnny L. Cochran, as the 2003 Thurgood Marshall Lecturer and Award winner. Civil libertarian, philanthropist, and America's most well-known trial attorney, Mr. Cochran has spent outspoken advocate and supporter of civil rights throughout his 4-decade career. This evening, we celebrate his contributions to the ongoing civil rights struggle and welcome the occasion to hear his thoughts and insights about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead of us. The Bunche Center, formerly known as CAS, was established in 1969 as an organized research unit at UCLA. Its primary mission is to facilitate research that enhances our understanding of the social, economic, political, and cultural realities impacting Black communities. Civil rights and social justice, of course, have always been a primary focus of this mission. Now, recent years have erected one hurdle after another as the center has endeavored to execute its mission. The passage of California Proposition 209 in 1996, for example, severely curtailed the number of African American students admitted to UCLA each year, which has challenged the political potency of one of the center's most important campus constituencies. Meanwhile, the state's current budget crisis has resulted in at least one significant budget cut for the center and virtually ensures that others are on the horizon. But the center continues to take these hurdles in stride. Our foundation-sponsored research and programs are at an all-time high. Our affiliated degree programs have been enhanced, and our students are stronger than ever. None of this would have been possible without the support of people like you, who have sponsored our events, research projects, and scholarships. For these generous contributions, including the proceeds from tonight's dinner, we would like to express our most sincere gratitude. We are proud of what the Center has achieved over the past third of a century, and we want you to know that your support will enable us to accomplish even more in the years ahead. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you UCLA's Vice Chancellor for Graduate Studies, Dean of the Graduate Division, Claudia Mitchell-Kernan. Dr. Mitchell-Kernan is widely known for her early work in the area of linguistic anthropology and for her classic studies in the late 1960s and early 1970s on the speech patterns of Black children. Her more recent research spans topics such as African American marriage patterns, children's discourse, and television and the socialization of minority children. Dr. Mitchell-Kernan, of course, is also fondly remembered by all of us here as the 8th director of the Center from 1976 to 1989. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Claudia Mitchell-Kernan.
Thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to join in UCLA and the Bunche Center's warm welcome. It's a wonderful occasion, and to see you all gathered here for this special lecture is very special for me. In 1987, when the first Thurgood Marshall Lecture was presented at UCLA's Center for African American Studies, the man we honored was still sitting on the US Supreme Court. Though he would remain there for 4 more years, his major professional accomplishments were already the stuff of history books. Thurgood Marshall stood, then and now, as a symbol of the great 20th century struggle to use the judicial system in the battle for civil rights to turn the system of oppression into a mechanism of liberation. In 1987, I was director of the Center for African American Studies, and a colleague on the law school faculty, Professor Henry McGee, came to me with the idea of establishing a lecture in Marshall's name. Our concern was simple. The period when the courts were making courageous decisions championing civil rights had ended, and the social impact of those decisions was being eroded by opposing forces. Professor McGee and I thought it was important to establish an annual occasion when Thurgood Marshall's dedication to the vision of equality for all Americans would be recalled and honored. Memory of his achievements might fade with time, we reasoned, and his strategies might lose force. But the brilliance and passion and persistence of his struggle would always remain relevant. I'd like to take a few moments tonight to recall a few of those achievements and their contemporary relevance. When young Thurgood Marshall gave up his plan to become a dentist and headed to law school, inequality for African Americans was supported by law in many places. Particularly in the South, Black people went to separate schools, drank from separate water fountains, stayed at separate hotels, and sat in designated seats at the back of the bus, or stood. Marshall refused to accept this state of affairs, and casting about for a tool to dismantle the system, he chose the courts themselves. From 1940 until 1961, Marshall was legal director of the NAACP during its successful battle against laws imposing racial segregation. Cases, he argued, resulted in the overthrow of the South's white primaries and racially restricted housing covenants. Then, focusing first on graduate and professional schools and later on elementary and high schools, he and his mentor Charles Hamilton won Supreme Court rulings that gave African Americans access to previously all-white educational institutions. By the early 1960s, he was a man of international renown. When the British government sat down with Kenyans to draft a constitution for a new nation, Thurgood Marshall, then in private practice, served as constitutional advisor. He traveled to Nairobi and later to London, where a constitutional conference was held. Given the number of times he had made use of the United States Bill of Rights, it's not surprising that Justice Marshall insisted on a Bill of Rights in Kenya's constitution. In 1961, President John Kennedy appointed Marshall to the U.S. Court of Appeals, where he wrote 112 opinions in 4 years, none of them overruled on appeal. After a short period as Solicitor General under Lyndon Johnson, Thurgood Marshall became the first African American to serve on the United States Supreme Court in 1967. On that bench, he compiled a sterling record of judicial wisdom and social consciousness, setting forth well-reasoned views on civil rights protections, abortion, and the death penalty, often in dissent against the court's majority. When Marshall retired in 1991, the bench lost a great jurist, and the struggle against institutionalized inequality lost a powerful advocate. Viewed through long decades of historical experience, his accomplishments may seem less imposing to some. While Brown versus the Board of Education remains a milestone in the struggle for civil rights, we know now that segregation is not ended when laws supporting it are destroyed, nor does the end of segregation necessarily mean that equity will prevail. Moreover, we've seen that the ebb and flow of judicial decisions can destroy initiatives to prevent racism and promote diversity, as if there were so many sandcastles. On April 1st, the U.S. Supreme Court heard lawyers for 3 white applicants argue that the University of Michigan's program to encourage diversity unjustly deprived them of their rights to attend. The Bush administration stood with them, although most of those who filed briefs, a record number, supported Michigan's strategies. When the Supreme Court outlawed racial quotas in 1978 in the case of the University of California Regents versus Allen Bakke, it allowed that the goal of achieving a diverse student body was important enough to justify racial considerations in admissions under some circumstances. In its plan, the University of Michigan adds 20 points on a scale of 150 points to the application of racial minorities and underprivileged applicants. The school also awards points to alumni relatives and Michigan residents, but the inequity of that strategy is not under assault. The court will issue its decision in due time. While the outcome remains in doubt, we have seen the legal tide turn against the forces of inclusion and equity. The judicial strategy Marshall pursued in his battle for civil rights does not always win the day. We have been challenged again and again to find new approaches to achieving the goal of a country founded on inclusiveness and equity. However, this does not in any way lessen the import of Thurgood Marshall's victory, nor does it destroy what may be his most lasting gift to us, and that is hope. Certainly in today's world, our courage will need the fuel provided by our hopes and our dreams. Marshall's life and career provide an inspiring model on how this is done. We can only imagine what Thurgood Marshall would say to us tonight as the court that so often witnessed the rigor of his argument and the eloquence of its rhetoric weighs this most recent decision. I think he might have made his point quite simply by reminding us to keep our eyes on the prize and not to forget the link between our own struggle against inequality and those of others, both within and outside our borders. Thank you.
It's like coming through a maze, and I did all of that just to say this. It's now time for dinner. We hope that you will stay with us throughout the entire evening. Now, please enjoy your dinner.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Kimberly Crenshaw, professor of law at the law school, and I have the great privilege, this evening of introducing our Thurgood Marshall 2003 honoree, attorney Johnny Cochrane. It is a special honor to introduce him this evening because he is a compelling recipient of this recognition, partly because Johnny Cochrane has now joined the pantheon of African American heroes, occupying a space beside the award's namesake, Thurgood Marshall. As I thought about why Mr. Cochrane was an especially fitting recipient for this award, I was struck by the fact that among African Americans, lawyers are held in particularly high esteem, quite unlike the cachet they hold in the general population. In fact, having been raised to admire, respect, and emulate the important role of lawyers in the struggle for racial justice in this country, I was somewhat dumbstruck by all the lawyer jokes that seemed to tickle the mainstream's funny bone. Of course, we in the black community do have one joke about the law. Actually, it really is more about the law than an indictment of lawyers, and I'm sure you've all heard it. It's more of a saying that we went to the state house to look for justice, and that's what we saw, just us. I suppose now it's time to update it. We saw just us and Johnny Cochrane. Our unique relationship to the law as African Americans was captured in this saying, and it gives us a window to appreciating the courage and the skill and the commitment of Thurgood Marshall and Johnny Cochrane. It tells us a little bit about why they're so admired and respected in our community. To paraphrase Derek Bell, we've been enslaved by law, emancipated by law, segregated by law, liberated by law, now incarcerated by law, and possibly resegregated by law. Sounds like a bad codependent relationship. Of course, this complicated relationship that we African Americans have with the law is precisely why brilliant legal practitioners and strategists like Thurgood Marshall and Johnny Cochrane are among the most valuable assets our community can call its own. There is no escape from the law. Our only task, therefore, is to learn the law, master the law, and to harness the law to do racial justice. Johnny Cochrane was perfectly suited to take up the mantle of this country's leading African American lawyer. A graduate of UCLA and later of Loyola Law School, Johnny Cochrane became one of the first African Americans to serve as deputy attorney in the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. Working his way up from prosecuting traffic offenses to more serious crimes, Mr. Cochrane became very familiar with the legal system from the inside, working with prosecutors, with police officers, and with judges. Now, although he writes in his recently published memoir, A Lawyer's Life, that he left after becoming increasingly disillusioned with the business-as-usual attitude taken by many in the system about the obvious fact that many officers were untruthful, the skills and associations he developed would serve him extremely well in his illustrious career that was to follow. Mr. Cochran eventually took his hard-won expertise and leveraged his experience to open up his own civil rights firm, specializing in litigating issues of police misconduct. His successes in Los Angeles include litigating against the use of the chokehold, a police practice that killed 17 black and brown men. You might remember that this was the controversy that prompted that statement by Daryl Gates that there's a difference between African Americans, Latinos on one hand, and normal people on the other hand. He also successfully litigated against the use of hog tying, a police practice that also had led to wrongful deaths. By the time the nation was introduced to Johnny Cochrane, following that enthralling low-speed chase on the 405 of his soon-to-be most famous client in the summer of 1994, Johnny Cochrane had already won millions of dollars in settlements and was clearly the lawyer that the city and the county of Los Angeles least wanted to see on the other side of the table. Of course, O.J. Simpson changed his life. Arguably, it changed all of our lives. Gallons of ink have been spilled analyzing the case, and particularly the angst on the part of some of our countrymen unleashed by his victory there can be psychoanalyzed for generations to come. Of course, for those afflicted with the belief that something very wrong happened in that case, the mind-boggling miscalculations, the sloppy police work, all that was part of standard police practices simply disappeared in the face of a more convenient target, that being Johnny Cochrane. Now, my mom always said, you gotta be twice as good. What she didn't tell me, maybe she forgot to mention it, you gotta be twice as good, but often being twice as good means that people will be twice as mad when you win. So people were more than mad. They were looking for someone to blame for Mr. Cochrane's success in that case. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is where we as critical race theorists come into the picture. Now, critical race theory, as some of you know, is a practice, a theory developed by some lawyers and scholars of color. Two of my colleagues here, Cheryl Harris and Devin Carbado, are also leaders in this field. But unbeknownst to us, according to the New Republic, and I quote here, the more striking example of critical race theory in the American legal system is the O.J. Simpson case, in which Johnny Cochrane dramatically enacted each of the most controversial postulates of the movement before a racially divided nation. Indeed, Cochrane's strategy in the courtroom might be best described as applied critical race theory. So I guess they found out about our secret meetings. This is classic race baiting, of course, and nothing was too ludicrous for people to postulate, but some of these performed a little bit too much, because I believe that most would admit that if they were in trouble with the law, they would call Johnny Cochrane in a heartbeat. So while detractors have not gotten beyond Orenthal James Simpson, Mr. Cochran has moved on, or rather back to an old client, Mr. Geronimo Pratt, a former Black Panther who served 27 years on a framed murder charge before Mr. Cochran won his release in 1997. Now, this alone tells you a lot about Johnny Cochrane. It tells you not only that he's a tireless, dogged workaholic, one that never gives up and is willing to fight the good, long fight, but one who's willing to use his skills as diligently for the dispossessed as he's willing to use them for his celebrity clients. Now, who in this room can say that we could work on something for 27 years and see it through till it was over, even when at times it looked hopeless? That's who Johnny Cochrane is. Johnny Cochrane makes what seems impossible to achieve a reality. He's a modern-day David to a number of Goliaths. He's taken on not only the Los Angeles City Police Department, New York, and Chicago, he's also delivered a good spanking to, or is in the process of delivering a good spanking to, Lockheed, Sony, Enron, and Microsoft, just to name a few. His His clients range from black to white, rich to poor, celebrity and nameless, like the 50 missing women in Vancouver, Canada, whose families he gives legal advice to. Not only has he won millions for his clients, most importantly, he has successfully challenged the systemic policies that allow these abuses to continue. He gets something for his clients, and he gets something for us too. So Johnny Cochrane is the embodiment of a fearless warrior with an excellent grip on reality and a good aim at the heart of the beast. Yet, he's not only a lawyer's lawyer, he's a gentleman's gentleman. Let me conclude with a few personal notes here. You know, there aren't many people who are as accomplished as Johnny Cochrane, people who have won every conceivable honor in their profession, who appear on every news show, whose presence in popular culture is ubiquitous. But of those who share the rarefied air with Johnny Cochrane, many of those folks wear it on their sleeves. They're a little bit curt, a little bit full, a tad self-indulgent. Not Johnny Cochrane. I had the occasion to be invited to his home for a fundraiser against the death penalty. That was a few years after the dean at the law school at that time, Susan Prager, had introduced me to him. And me that time was a young, tongue-tied assistant professor here at UCLA. I was certain as I approached the door that he would never remember me. Yet when I walked into his home, a guest among dozens of notables, he gave me the same warm hug, that heartful welcome, and called me by my name. Of course, I was touched by his down-to-earth genuineness and have been impressed ever since by his ability to make anybody feel comfortable and welcomed in his presence. I also have to tell you, for those who have only seen him at a distance, and all of you know he's been tapped by Ebony magazine as one of the 10 most styled African-American men in the country, that not only does he look good, he smells good. Whatever that is that he wears, I want to know what it is. And of course, you know, this all makes for a great story when I go back home to Canton, Ohio, and tell all the older ladies in the beauty shop. They always say, tell that story about Johnny Cochrane again. Talk about the cologne, how he smells good. I think if he marketed something just called Johnnie, it would sell 1 million units in one day. Which now brings me to my final story. And you know, I don't have to tell you all that Johnny Cochrane is the epitome of cool. But I bet you don't know how cool he really is. Now this summer, thank you, how cool is he? I had the privilege of golfing with Johnny and his wonderful wife, Dale, at the Black Enterprise Golf and Tennis Classic in Palm Springs. Don't ask me why anyone would go to the desert in August to play golf. That's a whole other story. But there we were, dozens of us, at 11 o'clock in the morning. Temperature is 108 and rising. Sun is beating down. People are sweating buckets, dropping light flies, saying impolite things, invoking God, our ancestors, and everything else. And there's Johnny Cochrane, leaning on his golf club, one foot crossed over the other, one gloved hand resting on the other, not a drop of perspiration in sight. Doing what he does best, holding court. That's the image of Johnny Cochrane I will always hold in my mind. Now, I said to myself, now that takes the saying, never let him see you sweat, to a whole new level of cool. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the 2003 Thurgood Marshall honoree, the elegant, the eloquent, the electrifying Johnny, never let him see you sweat, Cochrane.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kim. That was quite an introduction. Really. By the way, Kim is just an outstanding, outstanding professor, and UCLA is really, really blessed to have her here. No doubt about it. Good evening to all of you. It's always great to be back at UCLA. I first attended UCLA as a 17-year-old freshman from the inner city, and I spent 4 wonderful years here at UCLA. And today I had occasion to return to campus. I spent most of the day on campus. Had occasion to address a room full of law students at UCLA Law School today, and it was a memorable occasion. It was great to be back. I had an opportunity when Susan Westerberg Prager became the dean of the law school to teach at the law school for about 3 years when I was at assistant DA for LA County. And it was one of the greatest times of my life. I really loved it, and I always love being back on this campus. There's something very special about UCLA and the opportunity it's really afforded all of us. So I want to thank all of you tonight, the UCLA Center for African American Studies, for this great high honor regarding Thurgood Marshall. I should tell you a quick story. When I was 11 years of age, I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer. Now, at that time, you couldn't turn on the television. You didn't see a lot of lawyers around. So I didn't know a lot about what lawyers did, but I knew that I liked to argue and persuade and convince and to be an advocate. So I went and I told my father and my mother that I wanted to be a lawyer. Now, in those days, you had times when you would have dinner every night, and so the family would sit together, and we didn't know words like dysfunction or whatever at that point. So we sat at the table, and I remember we lived over on West 28th Street, and my mother and my father looked at me and said, "We want you to be a doctor." And I guess you could say that I won my very first case because I convinced them that I should become a lawyer. And I'm real pleased about that. And I should tell you that my father is here tonight with me tonight. He's still here, and he's Johnny Cochrane Sr. And so I was real pleased that I convinced him of that. But I still didn't know what lawyers did. So it wasn't until I was attending Los Angeles High School on May 17th, 1954, a day I will never forget, the day that the case of Brown versus the Board of Education came down, I started reading and learning about a remarkable lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the greatest lawyer, I think, of the 20th century, perhaps one of the greatest lawyers in the history of America. He, along with others, set the standard. He helped change America and make it a better place. You all know this case. And so from the very moment that I started reading about him and I understood about Charles Hamilton Houston and their strategizing and what they did, convincing 9 elderly gentlemen on the Supreme Court at that time that separate but equal was no longer the law of the land, and listening to Thurgood and how he used the law to change society for the better, I said, that's what I want to do. So I'm often heard to say around my office when we're faced with a legal dilemma, what would Thurgood do? And so tonight I want to talk to you briefly about this whole concept of the law, Thurgood Marshall as the ideal in a changing state of justice. Before I do that, however, Kimberly talked about this, about the role of the lawyer in our society, how that role is very often much maligned. In minority communities, it's still much revered. I practice law now for over 40 years, and every morning when I get up, I'm still honored, pleased, and blessed that I've had this opportunity to try and make a difference. I want to share with you what I think capsulizes who Thurgood Marshall is, what all of us should strive to do as lawyers. I am the lawyer. I displaced brute force with mercy, justice, and equity. I taught mankind to respect the rights of others, to their property, to their personal liberty, to freedom of conscience, to free speech and free assembly. I am the spokesman of every righteous cause. I plead for the poor, the persecuted, the widow, and the orphan. I maintain honor in the marketplace. I am the champion of unpopular causes. I am the foe of tyranny, oppression, and bureaucracy. I prepared the way for the 10 Commandments. I pleaded for the freedom of the slave in Greece and for the captive in Rome. I fought the Stamp Act. I wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Rights of Man. I defended the slave. I was an abolitionist. I signed the Emancipation Proclamation in every land and every clime. I punish the wicked, protect the innocent, raise up the lowly, oppose brutality and injustice. I fought in every war for liberty. I stand in the way of public clamor and the tyranny of the majority. I speak for the rich man when prejudice prevents him from getting justice, and I insist that the poor man be accorded all of his rights and privileges. I speak for the equality of mankind, regardless of color, caste, sex, or religion. I am for the parliament of man and for the abolition of all wars. I hate fraud, deceit, and trickery. I'm forbidden to serve two masters or to compromise with injustice. I am the conservative of the past, the liberal of the present, and the radical of the future. I believe in convention, but I cut the Gordian knot of formalism and red tape to do justice and equity. I'm the leader of mankind in every crisis. I'm the scapegoat of the world. I hold the right of mankind in the hollow of my hand, and I'm unable to obtain recognition of my own. I'm the pioneer, but I'm the last to renounce the past and to overturn the present. I am the just judge and the righteous ruler. I hear before I condemn. I seek the best in everything. I am the lawyer. And so tonight, thank you for this high honor in the name of Thurgood Marshall. It would not be possible for any one person to achieve an honor like this were it not for an outstanding family, which I'm very proud to have, met my father, and an outstanding staff. It's always there for me to help translate my vision into reality. And over at Table 13 are those who work with me on a daily basis at Table 13. Thank you all very much also. Now, for those of you who are worried about the Laker game, it's about 8:41. As King Henry VIII said to one of his many wives, I'm not going to keep you long tonight. But I wanted to share some thoughts with you about this marvelous man, Thurgood Marshall, and how it relates to the concept of justice as we see it. And I'm particularly proud of the center, how it's grown through the years into a distinguished place of educational advancement. Leaders with a vision for creating a place devoted to research on the history and culture of African people throughout the world, determined to make a difference. And because they never let go of that vision, we're all here today. Here we are in Southern California. The greater world around us is in a difficult state of affairs. The globe now turns too often with an undercurrent of fear. Insecurity abounds as we fight a war in a distant land. Ethnic fighting continues through the vast homeland of Africa. Political coups are commonplace all over South America. Japan seems to teeter on a never-ending financial seesaw. Mysterious diseases traverse entire continents. We see AIDS, hunger, homelessness, and poverty in lands near and far. Meanwhile, here at home, we're thought of as the world's greatest superpower, although we have an attorney general who is too often willing to trade our personal liberties for homeland security. We have an economy that has gone from robust to bust, and disgraceful corporate scandals and obliterated personal savings. Daily headlines are filled with stories of child abductions, wife disappearances, and Mercedes murders. I bring up these circumstances to remind you of one thing only. Now more than ever before in history, the notion of justice is vital to our survival. And Thurgood Marshall stood for nothing if not for justice. To this day, I strive to emulate the humanity, the bravery, the integrity, the decency, conviction of the civil rights attorney whose name we are gathered in to honor today, the great Thurgood Marshall. On July 4th, 1992, 2 days before he had celebrated his 84th birthday, and 13 months after he'd retired from the Supreme Court, a physically ailing Thurgood Marshall was lifted to the stage of the Independence Day celebration in Philadelphia. His health was poor, but his message was rich. With his trademark spirited vigor, here's what he said: "The battle has not yet been won. We've barely begun. Americans can do better. America has no choice but to do better, to assure justice for all Americans, Afro and white, rich and poor, educated and illiterate. Our futures are bound together." Now, that was over 10 years ago. We're now living amidst a time of much uncertainty. We must recognize we'll be tested every day by the external forces of the world that we live in. Therefore, it seems to me it's paramount that justice be administered as it was meant to be, with fairness and expediency, or we will all suffer. I believe that justice does ultimately win out in the end. As Kimberly talked about, sometimes it takes 27 years. Despite imperfections, the courts do remain the people's best and often only hope. For I see the courts as our civic temples. We don't have a state religion, but our courts are, in some respects, our civic temples, where Thurgood Marshall found his home and became a legend in doing so. He used the courtrooms as a tool for change in making integration an accepted factor in the equation of equality. He strove to deliver justice to the least among us. The man who won the most important case of the 20th century, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which desegregated our public schools, was and is my hero. The success of that landmark case could be considered the beginning of the civil rights movement as we know it. He changed America with that case alone, and he went on to many other monumental achievements. His Supreme Court victories, his 24-year tenure, broke the color line in so many areas of life: education, voting, housing, and transportation, just to name a few. I still look to his pioneering work in affirmative action as a guide to my own work on that issue. For the past decade or so, conservative groups have mounted a concerted attack against affirmative action, primarily through litigation. The decisions to be handed down by the Supreme Court in the coming months will have a lasting effect on how our nation's colleges and universities look. The cases of Gratz and Grutter versus Bollinger. And therefore, how our professions will look in the future, and eventually how our entire society will look for years to come. For when we unravel the threads that diversify our schools, we loosen the fabric of society as a whole. I, for one, will continue the fight to ensure that that does not ever happen. So what would ideal justice look like? I think in an ideal society, you would have a justice system that is accurate, that's attentive, that's accountable. A land truly governed by the rule of law. Now, court systems would be the purveyors of democracy. Just as laws have brought about so much change, they will continue to bring about change, but change for the better. Leaders would have the deepest personal and professional commitment to the principles of the constitutions that protect their citizens. And those citizens would demand, in one way or another, that those principles be upheld. And through it all, the underlying basis of democracy would be ignored by no one: equal justice under the law. But if you look at the reality that we have and live day by day, you see there is much work yet to be done. Too many inequities play out every day in our legal system. Minorities, immigrants, the poor, the other disenfranchised people deserve equal protection under the law. But America's historical background makes that difficult to begin with. There is inherent racism. The police officer on the beat has incredible power and sometimes doesn't mind abusing it. There are problems in prosecution, those who want only to win, not to seek justice. There are problems in sentencing, great racial disparities. The courts have cut time for which you can appeal. Resources have been severely cut. What is it then that bars true justice in this day and age? I believe that our noblest ideals are clouded by systems riddled with imperfections. Problems that plague systems everywhere create vicious cycles that never seem to end, and then no one wins. Consider the way the death penalty is carried out and often applied. One example would be the state of Illinois. Some of you know the story of Illinois and what Governor Ryan did several months back. Since the reinstitution of the death penalty after Furman versus Georgia, there have been 25 individuals sentenced to death in the state of Illinois. 25. 12 were put to death. 13 have walked off death row, judicially found innocent. So in a few moments, I'm going to leave here when we finish the speech, and I'm going to fly back east. If I were to invite each of you in this audience and say, I have a private plane out at LAX, I want you to come and fly with me. It's a beautiful plane. We'll fly at 600 miles per hour, and we'll get to New York in about 4 hours. We'll be comfortable along the way. The only problem with this plane is, with 25 flights, it will crash 13 times. None of you would want to fly with me, would you? That's what happens in this country right now with the death penalty. That's what happened in Illinois. Further, I represent a man named Anthony Porter who started this whole thing. Anthony Porter was that inmate on death row in Illinois, one of the 13 who walked off. Sitting in his cell, he had 2 days left to live. They came to measure him for his casket. They came to ask him what he wanted for his last meal. Fortunately, while this was going on, some journalism students at Northwestern were working because they believed that he was innocent. And within 2 days of his death, they not only found that he was innocent, they went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they found the true perpetrators of the crime. He got out with just 2 days to spare. And we're involved in some lengthy litigation now to seek some justice for this man who came within 2 days of being put to death. I worry about those 12 who were put to death. Nobody talks about them anymore. That battle is over. But the 13 who got out, who were innocent. And I want to say something about the spirit of Thurgood Marshall. In New York, I have the privilege of practicing law with Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. Since 1995, yes, they deserve a round of applause, I'll tell you. Since 1995, they have formulated and established throughout this country various and sundry Innocence Project chapters. As we sit here tonight, more than 100 men and women have walked out of prison, one just this week in Massachusetts, who were judicially innocent, many through DNA, many through misidentification, many through defense lawyers who slept through testimony, many through a system that really didn't care. And they have worked on each of these cases pro bono. They don't accept any fee. What they've done is tried to help right a system that has been imperfect and too often wrong. And so I deem it a privilege and a pleasure to have an opportunity to practice with them in New York and around the country as they're really striving to make a difference. They're striving to make this difference in the spirit of the great Thurgood Marshall. Consider, if you will, the realities of law enforcement. I spent most of my career working to right the wrongs of our nation's system. So very often I have firsthand knowledge of the offenses that take place. I've always been supportive of the police. In my book, I talk about this, and I talk to the students about this today. I'm in no way anti-police. In fact, my son is patrolling the freeways tonight. He's a highway patrol officer here in California. So I have no problem with the police. I'm not anti-police. I am anti-bad police practices. I often have a problem with the culture of protection within the forces. The so-called blue wall of silence that protects bad police officers from being punished for their wrongdoings must come down once and for all. And change has to come from without and from within. The rhetorical question of who polices the police always comes back to us. I want to share a brief story with you in this regard. When I first went to New York to start practicing, within that first year, within a few months of going to New York, a gentleman came to my office to see Sheikh Neufeld and I by the name of Abner Louima. He was a Haitian gentleman, a businessman, who was subjected to perhaps the most inhumane, degrading set of circumstances and brutality I've ever seen in the history of this country. He was sodomized in a precinct in Brooklyn because they believed that he'd struck a police officer. Of course, he had not done that. And he was left in a cell pretty much to die. Because of this blue wall of silence, in a police station that's smaller, about half of this entire room, as he was led away from the sergeant's desk, which is somewhat elevated, with his pants down around his ankles, nobody sought to stop that. As he was led off toward the bathroom, nobody stood up. When his colon was ruptured by the broom handle, it took 5 days from Saturday night to Thursday morning for the first police officer to even come forward and say what had happened, Eric Turetsky. You know what happened to him when he did that? He was in police custody and police protection for the next 3 years as they had various and sundry trials. But we thought and saw this case as one in which we could finally chip away at this blue wall of silence for those who didn't believe it existed. And we tried to do that. We worked very closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And tonight I can tell you that as a result of that case in New York, and really it had ramifications around the country, the officers were all punished. Justin Volpe, the main perpetrator, was given 30 years in prison. The others were put away through a vigorous prosecution by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. Mr. Louima was handsomely compensated, but none of you would take $9 million for what he went through. But it wasn't about the money with him. We did not accept a settlement in that case till two things at least took place in New York City. We found a system where a police officer were charged with an offense, a shooting or whatever. They had something called the 48-hour rule. You could not talk to a police officer. His supervisor, the chief, couldn't talk to him. The mayor couldn't talk to him for 48 hours after the occurrence because they negotiated that in the labor agreement. And of course, in that 48 hours, the only one who could talk to him was this one law firm that represented all the police officers. So what do you think happened as they got together and talked about this? So not only we insisted that the 48-hour rule had to go, we insisted there had to be more than one law firm to represent police officers. Somebody might want to tell the truth. Before we settled this case, there is now set up in New York a separate law firm where they can go. This is again in the spirit of Thurgood Marshall, where you see a wrong and you seek to right it, where you try to do something for those who have no one to stop and speak for them. That is what a lawyer should do. That's what lawyers should do in the tradition of Thurgood Marshall. Now, since September 11th, this has become an age of airport searches, metal detectors, and no-knock raids. Wiretaps, and DNA databanks, and systems for monitoring our driving patterns are all firmly in place and used extensively by authorities, whether we know it or not. The day when our private telephone conversations and faxes and emails, financial transactions and health records are not protected from snooping isn't very far off. Not just by hackers, I mind you, thieves and nosy neighbors, but by our government as well. For instance, there is a provision on the U.S. law books called the Usa Patriot Act. If you haven't seen this act, you ought to take the time to read it, which permits law enforcement agencies to circumvent probable cause when conducting wiretaps and searches if the gathering of foreign intelligence is its significant purpose. Secret trials to try non-U.S. citizens suspected of terrorism can be held anywhere in the world without juries. panels of military officers serve as judges who have the power to impose the death penalty. If 2/3 of these uniformed judges agree, there are no appeals to these sentences. Defendants may or may not be able to choose their own counsel. Much of the prosecution's evidence may be withheld from the defendant, and the standard for proving guilt can easily fall below the accepted standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. The list goes on. Perhaps we'd make more progress if we attacked the underlying problems that cause crime to begin with. If we don't intervene in the tragic cycles that divert justice, we will all pay the price. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We stand to lose a sense of compassion and a sense that, as Thurgood Marshall reminded the audience that day in Philadelphia, there is a common destiny for us all. Have we reached the point where the criminal justice system is merely a weapon for fighting crime? Perhaps we should focus on diminishing the social roots of crime rather than increasing the penalties for committing them. As we are clearly concerned about the state of affairs today and in the future, we must never forget, ever, how far advocates for justice have come. For real change has taken place in the world, thanks to people like Thurgood Marshall, whose extraordinary efforts provide powerful examples for all of us to emulate, virtuous paths which beckon us to follow, visions of inspiration that motivate each and every one of us and proclaim the call which cries out for our response and our answer. Surely everyone here tonight has that same drive to foster change in society, to make it better for all of us and especially the least of us. I hope that I have that drive, and I hope I always will. I hope that tonight's honor will refocus me and help me to fight on. It's always been about pursuing this vision of justice, of making the law accessible to all the citizens of this great country. I can honestly say that I'm doing with my life exactly what I always wanted to do once I got permission to be a lawyer. I can remember those early days. I knew what I wanted to do. Thurgood Marshall gave me purpose in what I wanted to do. To me, becoming a lawyer was about bettering myself and serving others, just as Thurgood Marshall had. People ask me all the time, why do you practice law? And I say succinctly, I practice law to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. This then is a time for inequities to be balanced everywhere. The needs of the world and its citizens have changed, perhaps forever. There is a new paradigm, as you know, in the world. But we should use the energy of uncertainty that we face to emerge with resolve and forge ahead with unflinching resoluteness. In each of your faces here tonight, I see the legacy of UCLA and the possibilities of great things still to come. You know, when we consider our mortality, we tend to wonder how we might best be remembered. Thurgood Marshall knew how he wanted to be remembered, and he explained it in the powerful simplicity he was known for. Quote, that he did what he could with what he had. For each of us, too, do what we can with what we're given. That's my hope for all of us tonight. May all of us continue to grow as individuals and as people, to give the world what it needs from us. If you think of Thurgood Marshall as I do, in your lives and in your work, you will always stay the course on the road to justice. We can do no less, because we would not, all of us here tonight, are really the blessed. As I look about this audience, I'm mindful of those who couldn't afford to be here tonight. Somebody has to stand up and speak out for them. Somebody has to represent them. That's what we have to do to make America the great nation that it ought to be. It's not enough to say we're the greatest nation in the world, and we are, but we can do better. Thurgood Marshall said that all those years ago. We have this common destiny, for truly none of us will be free until all of us have the same rights and the same opportunity, and there's equality of opportunity and justice for all citizens. Let's do that. I'm inspired to go on, and there must be others who come along. That's why this case, this affirmative action case, is so important. There are untold youngsters who won't get a chance unless the court makes the right decision. Let's pray and hope that they do that. Thank you. You've been a great audience tonight. God bless.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Theresa White, and I am a doctoral candidate here at UCLA, completing my studies in education, cultural studies, and media. I just got the terrific news that I'm the recipient of the pre-doctoral fellowship administered through the Institute of American Cultures and then through African American Studies. And so as such, I've been afforded the privilege. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's a blessing in and of itself, but as such, I've been afforded the privilege of giving Mr. Cochran this particular honor. The Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA proudly presents this award to Mr. Johnny L. Cochran, Jr. for his leadership and commitment to the struggle for civil rights and for delivering the keynote address for the 14th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights, April 10th of 2003.
Congratulations to you. Thank you very much. So you got to get our picture. Thank you. Congratulations. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
All right, good. One more. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
We have some special presentations for Mr. Attorney Cochran. First, from Senator Dianne Feinstein's office. Okay, we're going to move right along. City Attorney's Office and Deputy Mayor Brian Williams. Okay. No, okay. Okay, from the mayor's office.
Good evening. Thank you. I'm Commissioner Leslie Ann Ortigue, and I am Chair of the Commission on the Status of Women, and I'm representing the City of Los Angeles tonight. Mr. Cochran, would you please come forward? On behalf of the Mayor, it is my pleasure to present his sincere congratulations to you on being honored by the UCLA Ralph J. Bunche Center at his Thurgood Marshall Lecture and dinner for your outstanding accomplishments throughout the years. Best wishes for continued success.
Thank you very much.
Yes, please. Okay. And from the office of the Speaker of the Assembly, Herb Wesson Jr.'s office, Akili.
There are times when being the special assistant to the Speaker comes in handy and is a good job. There are times when being a special assistant to the Speaker means you get a good meal. There are times when being a special assistant to the Speaker of the California State Assembly means you get to hear a good presentation. There are times when being a special assistant to the Speaker of the California State Assembly means you get to recognize somebody with a resolution. This is one of those times. I'm glad that I have this opportunity to do it. I know the Speaker would rather be here to do it, but this is one of the times I'm glad I have this job. So on behalf of the Speaker of the the Assembly for the state of California, we want to say to Mr. Cochran, thank you for being a voice for the voiceless. Thank you for your commitment to reparations. Thank you. You have become synonymous with the best legal defense. Brothers on the street say, if you mess with me, I'll get Johnny Cochrane. Thank you for living up to the best of the tradition of Thurgood Marshall. But more importantly, thank you for being an inspiration to the next Thurgood Marshalls and Johnny Cochrane. So on behalf of the Speaker of the State of California, we want to present this resolution to you and say thank you and say we appreciate what you've done and we look forward to your doing more.
No. One more. And a special congratulations from Mr. Cochrane's fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi.
On behalf of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated Upsilon Chapter, we would like to commend Brother Johnny Cochrane Jr. for achievement in the fields of law and civil rights.
Thank you, guys. Thanks very much, brother. Thank you very much. See you next week. Call on you tomorrow.
Well, I think we can all agree it's been a beautiful evening. I think we can all agree that we're all going to leave here a lot better than we were when we arrived. And I think we can all agree that our lives are much better because of the works of Mr. Attorney Johnny Cochrane. So now, on behalf of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, I'd like to thank all of you for being out here this evening, joining us. And we hope to see you again next year. Until then, drive safely and take care of yourselves. Good evening.